Welcome to Educators Podcast. Hi, my name is Swapnil. I work as an intensive care specialist in Sydney. And today it's my honor and privilege to welcome a very special guest from Northwell, Dr. Alice Fornari. Now, this is a special podcast. This is the end of your podcast. Also, this is a holiday or festive season podcast. So first of all, to all viewers, I hope you had a very great Christmas. Also, you're getting ready for the celebration of New Year. So welcome, Dr. Fornari.
Thank you very much.
And tell me, how was your holidays?
My holidays were very celebratory. I was in Washington, D.C. and I celebrated with some of my children. And we went to the zoo and saw many museums and really enjoyed beautiful weather in Washington. That was quite lovely.
That's great to hear. Often as we go into the new years, we look back on our year before and try to reflect upon 2019 and just to give us idea about how's your 2019 been and what are your key achievements in 2019.
So for 2019, it was a very exciting year for me professionally. I received a lot of nice recognition for some work that I do in faculty development for a very special project I have called MedEd, Mentoring and Professionalism in Training. And it's a project that started in 2014 with a grant from the Arnold P. Gold Foundation, which is focused on humanism. And with that grant, I was able to set up a program at Northwell that's been highly, highly successful. And we're in our 6th year, and Northwell took over the grant program after 2 years. And we've had a very, very successful growth of that program. It's an interprofessional program. It gives me much pleasure, and it's focused on humanistic mentoring skills. And this year, the program got an award from the Schwartz Foundation, which is focused on compassionate care. So it was a pretty exciting year for me.
Congratulations, first of all. You're doing a great work, and obviously it's getting recognition at the same time. So fantastic news, and I hope the 2020 will bring even more success to your program. Well done. Today, I'm very excited as we are going to dive deeper in a very unique topic in medical education, that is community of practice. So first of all, I'd like to start by asking you, Dr. Fornari, what is the community of practice?
Well, community of practice is a term that comes from the literature of Lave and Wanger, really. So more from the positive psychology literature under their direction. And it has 3 very, very strong characteristics. One of them is that a group of like-minded people come together and they meet, but they don't just meet, they also discuss something that's passionate to them. So whatever topic it is. So for me, let's say mentoring, I'm passionate about. So if I sit in a room with a group of like-minded people who are interested in mentoring and specifically humanistic mentoring, we have a similar passion. But the third characteristic is very important. As we're building a relationship because we have a common topic, we're sharing resources or tools or ideas together to enhance what we're interested in. So it's relationship building around a common passion. And for most of my communities of practice, that's some medical education topic. And the third item is sharing of resources and tools and working on a project together. And once that project is delivered, it's a very exciting moment for the community of practice.
Great. So what I hear is it's kind of a similarity between networking. Are they same, or what's the difference between the community of practice and networking?
I would say they're actually quite different. Within a community of practice, you're building relationships. And when you're networking, you could also be building relationships with somebody you don't know. But that person might have an interest of yours or know somebody else who has an interest of yours. So it's not necessarily the person you're networking with, but the person they connect you to that might have a similar interest. And in general, when you're networking, you're not necessarily sharing resources and working on a project. You're working towards extending your professional universe to find people who are like minded. So, networking is a skill that could help you enter a community of practice and be with people who are like minded and want to work on similar projects. So, the skill of networking, I think, is very, very important skill to lead to building your own communities of practice or helping others build communities of practice.
Thanks. I think that's a really, really good point. And I think for budding educators, it's really important to understand that networking is a tool to reach or build their own community of practice. So that's kind of a nice segue into the next question, that what are the different types or forms of community of practices?
Well, I think that a community of practice could happen in any context as long as the three characteristics I mentioned previously are present: relationship, passion for a topic, and sharing of resources and perhaps a project. So there are many types of community of practice. People can do them in their clinical settings, education settings, research settings for sure, service learning settings. So there are an endless number of types of community of practice as long as characteristically they encompass the core principles.
Okay. As you mentioned, the key points are relationship building, passion about the topic, and then sharing the resources. And I guess with the modern world, with the social media and networking, it's become more and more easy to kind of achieve these goals. What's your experience been around this field? Are we embracing or are we growing up with this concept, or we are still lagging behind, especially in the medical education world, to achieve the communities of practices?
Well, it's very interesting because I think social media is a wonderful way to find community. You can be on Twitter and find like minded people, or Facebook and find like minded people, for sure. And that's something that's part of being in a community of practice. So that's a wonderful tool of social media, without a doubt. You could write a blog, and as people comment on your blog, you could find other people who are like minded like you. So I think communities of practice flourish and begin sometimes from the social media world. But even within the social media world, there are communities of practice, perhaps not 100%. But if you think about my interest in medical humanities, and there's a Twitter group called MedHum, Medical Humanities, there are people in that group that I'd like to form relationships with, and I need to reach out to them to connect. They most likely, if they're in that group, have a similar passion of mine. But we're not necessarily working on something together unless we make an individual connection. So just being in a group doesn't mean you're in a community of practice. So social media can create communities of practice. They can support communities of practice. But just because you're using social media doesn't mean you're in a community of practice.
Thanks, Dr. Fornari. I think that's really important, that you have to then take that extra effort to form the community of practice, which is meaningful. Just joining the Twitter or just joining the conversation is not enough to be or to form a community of practice. You need to take that extra effort. As you mentioned, the passion and sharing the resources and work on some common goal or common project. I think that's the key. And I think one of the great example for me is Harvard Macy. And that's been kind of a very dear to my heart. And I've learned quite a lot when I joined Harvard Macy. And I see that as a very successful community of practice in medical education.
I agree with you 100%. As an example of a community of practice, Harvard Macy is a wonderful example. It's a perfect example of a community of practice. And that's why it has sustained itself for so long. And people keep joining it and they keep adding to it. And the relationships keep building around common passions, be it education, assessment, leadership, digital technology, the humanities with the new art connection of Harvard Macy through their fellowship. So all those enable people to join with like-minded people and work on projects together. So absolutely, Harvard Macy is a fabulous example of a successful community of practice.
Yeah, that's right. And even within the Harvard Macy, there are so many sub communities of practices. Say, for example, I recently done Art Museum Health Educator Fellowship, and that itself formed a new community of practice. And there's a lot of interesting projects going on that space now where a lot of educators around the world are trying to use the museum within their education as one of the pedagogies. So I
Right.
guess within Harvard Macy, it allows you to even form a different communities of practices, and which is kind of fabulous and wonderful for me.
Right. It's not stagnant at all. It's very dynamic. And new communities of practice can constantly come from within the Harvard Macy larger community of practice.
That's right. And are there any other different examples of successful communities of practices in medical education apart from Harvard Macy?
Well, I even think the Association of Medical Education of Europe, which is a very large organization, 5,000 people or more, covering not just Europe, but also Asia and Australia and New Zealand, all over. It's a very large community. And within the AMI community, there are small communities of practice where people have connected and worked on projects. And then within the AMI community, there's the Ottawa people who are really focused on assessment, and that's another community of practice. And then finally, more recently, the development by Yvonne Steiner of the International Faculty Development Group. Within that group, there are smaller communities of practice who are very focused on faculty development working together. So I think that's another good example of a community of practice.
Yeah, thanks. I think AMI is growing quite significantly every year, and I think I could see a lot of interest because people get a common platform to come and talk to each other. It's a perfect platform for not just for networking, but also to build or create a new community of practice, I guess. And I think, as you said, sometimes the community practice are self-sustainable because people find a common goal and common motive in those joining those community of practices. So I think, and that's probably the reason why AMI is growing every year.
Exactly, because there are people who are working offline from the actual AMI experience in person and working on common passions together and staying connected.
Yeah, and I think the medical education is a unique. I think with a lot of other specialties, say if I work in intensive care or somebody works in emergency, they have already kind of grown or well-developed community of practices even like 10 years ago or 20 years ago. Medical education is slightly late in that space, catching up with this community of practice. Do you think it's a kind of same feeling, or why are we kind of lagging behind compared to our specialty practices?
Well, I think clinical specialties that take care of a subset of patients, be it emergency medicine or internal medicine or pediatrics or OBGYN, have a common linkage through their interest in a patient and therefore can formulate projects together. Medical education is much more vast. There are the divisions of undergraduate, graduate, and then continuing professional development. And I think looking at those three divisions allows people to settle in an area that they can find like-minded people. But more important, even within undergrad, there are the people who do more the basic science and then people who do more the clinical. And then, of course, graduate medical education is subdivided by specialties. So I think that it makes it harder that way because the group is larger to begin with. So you need to find smaller communities of practice to be part of. So if you think about an organization like IAMC, the International Association of Medical Science Educators, was originally started because the basic sciences or the scientists in medical education didn't have a home. So IAMC got created for the basic scientists. And they were able to find like-minded people and work with those people on projects and fuel their scholarship and their education through memberships in communities of practice focused on basic scientists. When the medical curriculum became more enabled to be integrated, which it is today, an integrated curriculum, what happened is the basic scientists no longer were going to be alone. They were going to be integrated with clinicians. So that group has to recreate itself into an integrated basic and clinical science group and form communities of practice that have both types of professionals.
That's right. And I guess that kind of important point, community of practice needs to be dynamic, it needs to be flexible, and it needs to adjust as the time goes. If it's stagnant or if it's rigid, there's a likely chance that it might become obsolete in next few years if you don't adapt to the new norms.
Right.
And I think the interesting phenomenon that I'm seeing now, that medical education is entering within each specialty as a sub community of practice. And I think Allium is another good example of community practice. It's a medical education within the emergency medicine space, and it's growing day by day, and it's becoming probably the quite a standard of medical education within the emergency. And it also gave a lot of us insights into how medical education can become a sub community of practice within the clinical specialties.
I agree with you. The nice thing about ALIM is it is within the specialty of emergency medicine, but they have attracted a large amount of people because within that larger community of practice, there are sub-communities of practice that exist very strongly, and people working on different projects within that larger community of practice.
Yeah, and I guess because it's not just about the established educators, but also there is no faculty incubator program. And I guess that has been an example how to create a budding educators, and similar to Harvard Massey, where you kind of train new people, younger generation, and train them how to be a good medical educator. So I guess that's kind of a niche community of practice within itself, within the medical education. So again, hats off to all those people who are creating a meaningful communities of practices. Now, the key question for this whole podcast, because this podcast is meant for budding medical educators, why budding medical educators should bother about joining a community of practice in medical education?
I think there's a few reasons. One is that medical educators don't work in isolation. And normally in the clinical setting, you find clinical team members that you work with. It's very natural or holistic how it happens. But in the medical education world, you need to seek people who have these common passions as yours and want to work together. And it's very important that you don't work in isolation. And for one reason is you don't know everything. So talking and working with other people gives you new knowledge or enhanced knowledge. The other thing is generally you need to pilot medical education ideas and strategies. And it's better to have a larger audience. Some of the audiences medical educators work with could be too small to give you rich enough data. And the third thing is that cross-institution scholarship leading to presentations and publications are much more interesting to the end receiver, the audience, the readership of something if there's perspectives from more than one institution. So the way to make this happen is to be part of communities of practice where you share knowledge, you share data, and you work on dissemination together.
That's right. And I think that's really important that budding medical educators join at least a community of practice to test what it looks like. And once they see the benefits of joining the community of practice, obviously they might start the conversation, they might start their own community of practice or expand their current community of practice. So I think that's really important.
I think it's key that you, by meeting people and forming these relationships, you might start your own community of practice. And that's something that's very naturalistic by attempting to join communities of practice and then having subdivisions of that. And I think that's a natural process of communities of practice.
Yeah, and I guess kind of interesting twist on that from my side is, and I kind of sometimes get worried about, because as I see on social media, there's so many communities of practices now kind of coming up. And now I just sometimes feel that are these different communities of practices are dividing us more and pushing us back into our own silos. And it almost feels like that tribal culture. And then are we losing that kind of universalism of being a medical educator, and then we're just forced into this some kind of community of practice, and people becoming too passionate or sometimes even too entitled about this particular community of practice. Do you see that danger of being labeled within the one community of practice and then losing that insight of what's happening on the global platform? Do you think that can be a danger?
Well, I think as a medical educator, you can't focus on every aspect of medical education. It's just too large a field and too broad. So you're going to develop expertise, be it in curriculum development, be it in assessment, be it in faculty development, being in certain educational strategies, case-based learning, team-based learning, simulation. So certainly you're going to develop expertise, and joining those communities of practice will only enable you to do more and enhance who you are personally and professionally. Once again, being in a group doesn't mean you're in a community of practice, because within a community of practice, you are building relationships and group experiences, but you actually have to be sharing resources and working on a project together to have a more robust outcome. So this really requires the next level of engagement within a group. So just being in a group doesn't necessarily mean you're in a community of practice.
Yeah, and I think that's important. You can be a part of 2 or 3 communities of practices at the same time, because yes, you can be expert in simulation, but also you want to focus on assessment within the simulation. So I guess you can be part of 2 or 3 different communities of practices.
Absolutely.
So what are the ideal characteristics of successful community of practice?
Well, to measure success, one is that it maintains itself with internal leadership among the group. So there's not an external facilitator necessarily running the show. The group itself is dynamic enough that they run themselves and once again work on projects together and share resources. So I think that's a characteristic of a community of practice. So it's led by the group members is really important. I think any of the products that come out of that group, be a presentation, a poster, a paper that people work on together, any piece of scholarship that comes out of a community of practice should definitely be looked at as a success. The other thing you could look at is actually skill building of a certain skill within a community of practice if it's focused on that. So one of the things in my mentoring grant was humanistic mentoring skills. And I was able to measure pre-post using a community of practice model whether the humanistic mentoring skills increased. That took a lot of resources, but I was able to do a study design like that. And the last thing that you can begin to build on, which I believe is a hypothesis I have at this point, is that communities of practice create resilience in the work environment and are very additive to engagement and how engaged people feel in their work environments. And once there's engagement and meaning in work, people will be more resilient and be able to pursue the passions that drove them into medicine to begin with.
Yeah, that's such a key advice. And I think that's a key takeaway message for me, that how to identify or even how to think about building a successful community of practice. As you mentioned, the self-sustainability is really important. And I think having clear goals and then the passion and engagement or meaning is really important. I think the scholarship is sometimes we often neglect that aspect, but I think the scholarship is really, really one of the majors of success nowadays in this modern era. And I think if you're not producing something meaningful out of that community practice, I think there's likely chance that people won't recognize in next few years. So I think the focus has to be multidimensional when you look at the success of community of practice. And I guess the point that you mentioned are really, really crucial for those who are thinking of developing a community of practice.
I agree.
I think you partly covered this answer before, but kind of what are the precautions that budding medical educators should consider before becoming the part of particular community of practice or before starting a community of practice?
Well, I think everybody has to consider the time they have to dedicate to a group, to form relationships and work on projects together and be accountable to self and others. I think that's a big part of maturity you have to self-assess that. It's probably one of the most important things. And the other is to be able to accept working within a community where there's not a hierarchical structure, and actually it's a much more non-hierarchical and not even linear structure. It's much more of a structure where there's intertwining and overlapping and a little bit of dissecting what somebody brings to the table and being able to negotiate all these coming together into a product that's agreed upon. So I think it's really important that when we look at somebody going into community of practice, that they do have a reflective capacity to self-assess who they are and where they are at this moment.
Yeah, again, I think that brings to the common principle that you need to understand what's your purpose and what's your goal. And I guess time is very important that you mentioned about that. Nowadays, we all struggle to strike a balance between your specialty practices plus medical education, and then thinking about devoting extra time for this, be a part of the community practice. But it's really important that you devote a reasonable amount of time to your community of practice in order to gain the benefits of being the part of the community of practice. I think that's really crucial.
Yeah, definitely.
Say I was quite naive before, and I just wanted to see what medical education field looks like. And a simple way to do sometimes is join the very largest community of practice in that field and then start from there. And I think one of the best thing I did in my career is to join Harvard Macy. And I think that just opened the various opportunities for me. And then I became the part of different communities of practices. So sometimes joining the biggest community of practice in your field or within the medical education, I guess itself opens or gives you the idea about what it means to be a part of community of practice. And then you can then branch it out.
Right. I agree with you on that, but not everybody has the finances to join a community of practice like Harvard Macy. So it should not deter you that that's the only place to begin, because there is a financial commitment that is out of range for many people.
Yeah, I agree. And thanks for bringing that point, because I think sometimes that is also the added factor. And a lot of us probably don't pay kind of too much attention, because most of the time the institute covers the funding and we're not paying out of pocket. And that's why we don't bother about those aspects. But for certain educators, yes, that's a major barrier to join community of practices. But I guess now with the social media, it has opened a whole lot of different world itself, because you can be part of the same community via social media. And I think that's something which is kind of interesting space, that you can be part of the meaningful conversations through social media and then start the conversations, build relationship, start working on common projects. So I think that's kind of compromise if you don't have the financial support.
Right.
So I guess you have this extensive experience of faculty development, and also you're working on this humanities in medical education. What's your key insights from your experience about this building the community of practices within those kind of niche areas?
Well, I've been building communities of practice where I work specific to health humanities, because it was really didn't exist here that people who had an interest in the health humanities were together and talking together and working together. And we've created an elective for medical students focused on health humanities. So that's been a wonderful experience, because I have about 14 faculty who are interested in this. And we work passionately on delivering this content either to residents or students or even other faculty. So that's quite exciting. So I also have built a community of practice a little larger within my regional group of the AAMC called the Northeast Group on Educational Affairs. And they allowed me to establish a special interest group in health humanities. And I brought together a number of people who are like-minded and interested in the health humanities to work together and share thoughts just like that. And we're working on projects. So right now, one of the projects we're working on is a pre-conference focused on health humanities that's going to be delivered at the regional meeting. The other project we're working on together is webinar series on health humanities that's open to anyone. And those happen somewhat quarterly, every few months. So I've created communities of practice out of interests that I have.
That's great. And I guess as you're expanding, I think as everybody's expanding, they can join the dots and then that becomes the bigger community of humanities in health. And I think that's the important conversation itself. So all those budding medical educators who want to join the humanities, I think you're free to contact Dr. Alice Fornari via Twitter and join her community of practice.
Right. We're having a webinar in February, and it goes on Twitter. It hasn't been advertised yet because it's a little early, but certainly it's available, and it would be on Twitter about that webinar and pushing it out, and on the Harvard Macy page as well, so other like-minded people can join us and continue to be in a learning mode about a topic like health humanities.
Absolutely. Such a great opportunity to, again, join another community of practice.
Right.
So what's your advice to budding medical educators?
My advice is to join communities of practice, honestly, because I think it's very hard to do the work we do alone. And it is very, very nice to work with like-minded people and build relationships with people and really eventually work on projects that create scholarship through dissemination, either through conferences or publication. So my recommendation is always for new medical educators or people who are not even new to the field to make sure you're involved with communities that have like-minded interest of yours and go to the next step and work on projects within those communities.
Thanks, Dr. Fornari. I think it's such a wonderful piece of advice. And there's so many great pearls of wisdom in this whole podcast. And I think I personally learned quite a lot just from the last 30 minutes of conversation. Now, if budding medical educators want to contact you or get in touch with you regarding this particular concept, or if they're particularly interested in medical humanities, what's your best contact details?
And the other area that I have a great interest in is mentoring. We did not discuss it at length, but mentoring and I'd say medical humanities as well as overall faculty development. I do have a faculty development webpage that's on my website of the Donald and Barbara Zucker School of Medicine. And under faculty, there's a faculty development website that's open to the public. It's open access. It does not require a password. And the best way to get in contact with me is through my email, which is Fornari, that's Alice, my first name, so Fornari at Northwell, NORTHWELL.edu.
Thanks. And I guess, faculty development itself it's a huge topic. So probably I can save that for the next time for the podcast.
Yeah, that's a big topic in general, yes.
Yes, but I think you gave me another podcast for next year. So thanks for that.
Okay, that would be wonderful. I'd be glad to come back. And I thank you for the invitation for joining you and look forward to meeting new people through this podcast. And yes, I hope to see you at Harvard Macy Institute.
Thanks for sparing a valuable time on your holiday season. And I'm pretty sure you will have wonderful New Year celebrations, and the New Year will bring a lot of success and joy to you and your colleagues at Northwell. So
thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.